Welcome everyone for today's session. We'll wait for 1 more minute for a few people to join and then we'll begin. Thank you.
Recording in progress.
Maybe we will begin now. So once again, welcome you all for today's session. Myself, Anandan from the Asia Leads Partnership. A very good morning, good afternoon, depending on wherever you are. So today is day 7 of the Asia Leads Partnership Forum 2021. And this day is specifically allotted for finance sessions. In the morning, we had a session on accelerating investments to support NDC implementation and low emission development. And this session specifically focuses on global carbon market instruments to achieve climate goals. This session is organized with support of Global Carbon Markets Initiative of GIZ. So we would like to give a brief housekeeping rules before we move on to the technical presentations and hand it over to the GCM colleagues. We request all participants to keep the online messaging and other chat apps in silent mode to be able to fully focus on the session. And this session is will be delivered in English, and interpretation is available in Bahasa Indonesia language. You could choose the language option at the bottom. You see it in the first image. You can choose the language which you want to listen to, and participants can send the questions using Q&A box at any point during the session. And during Q&A session, based on time availability, participants will be allowed to ask questions directly to the speakers. To enable us to unmute you, you will have to click raise the hand icon that you see at the bottom so that we could unmute you. For the participants who are joining first time through Wova platform, you can see the second image where you can you have the option of adding further upcoming sessions to my agenda to be able to get notifications. And participants who are joining from Zoom, you can log into Wova to see the past session recordings and to interact with speakers and fellow participants. As you all know, this session is also being live streamed in ALP YouTube channel. The session is being recorded and would be shared later on. So here is the agenda for today's session. Mr. Kundan Bernwal, advisor from Global Carbon Markets, will give an introduction of the global carbon market instruments, and also he will present on carbon pricing, its rationale and instruments, followed by which we have Maximilian, who will, his junior advisor of GCM team, he will present on Article 6 and voluntary carbon markets. We will then have an interactive session after the presentations. It is also planned to have a lot of polls and a lot of interactive options are being planned as part of these sessions. Finally, we have Lydia, project team lead of carbon market project, who will deliver a pre-training assessment. And then finally, we have the closing by ICLEI South Asia or ALP Secretariat, and we will have a virtual group photo. These are the facilitators and speakers for today's session. We are very much pleased to have Global Carbon Market Project team today here with us. First of all, we would like to introduce Mr. Kundan Bernwal. He has over 14 years of experience on climate change, carbon markets, MRV, and sustainability. He serves as advisor climate change division at GIZ India. He is leading the works on carbon markets, climate change mitigation, and forestry. He has extensive experience in CDM and voluntary carbon markets. We welcome you, Kundan. Over to you for further proceedings. We hope we all will have a very good session today. Over to you.
Thanks, Anandan, for that. For those nice words. I would like to first of all welcome all of you to this session. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, based on where you are. I hope we keep this session as interesting as possible. This is a different kind of a session. So this session is different because we intend to give you a sneak peek into the topic of carbon pricing and carbon markets via two input presentations, as the Global Carbon Market project that Anandan talked about has developed a training content that we intend to popularize and use for training of public and private sector decision makers. But before that, I'll give you a brief background on the project. So GIZ is implementing a global project called Global Carbon Markets, and I'm leading the India chapter of this Global Carbon Markets project, which is being implemented in multiple countries, including India, Chile, Tunisia, Uganda, and the Caribbean, with the objective of enhancing capacities of public and private sector decision makers for using new and existing carbon market and climate finance instruments that can help the countries in achieving their climate goals. Now, having said that, a lot has been said of the levels of ambition which has been represented in terms of nationally determined contributions to be insufficient to meet the Paris climate goals. And most of us probably present here know about that. However, it is extremely important for us to understand the magnitude of this issue. Why do we always keep talking about the levels of ambition being insufficient? That is primarily because there are estimates which says that the overall ambition needs to be roughly tripled if the global community was to align with the 2-degree limit, and must be increased by almost 5-folds if we were to align with the 1.5-degree limit of the Paris Agreement. Now we are speaking about multiplications of these ambitions by the tune of 3 or 5, which would essentially require systems change, which in turn would require huge amounts of investments, which cannot be achieved by the public sector alone. And I'll cite an example. For example, the European Union, if they were to achieve the 55% emission reduction target by 2030, they would require an additional 350 billion euros to be invested annually in the period between 2021 and 2030, in comparison to what they had done in the previous decade, that is between 2011 and 2020. So we are talking about huge sums of money, and this cannot be met by the public finances alone. And hence, it is important that we unleash the private sector finances, which can potentially power the shift towards zero carbon economy. Now, this in turn can be, of course, accomplished if carbon dioxide is priced high enough to establish a business case for decarbonization. And that is what we are going to talk about in the two input presentations that we have. But before that, in order to understand the level of understanding on the topic from the audience, we have a small Menti question. If you could, Saurabh has shared the Menti question in the chat. I would request all of you to actively participate in the Menti question. We will be sharing the screen and showing the results of the Menti question. So the first question is, which one of the following sentences does describe your knowledge on carbon pricing instruments? The first is, I've never heard about it. The second is, I think that carbon pricing is connected to the average price of coal being traded globally. The third is, I know carbon pricing is a market-based instrument that aims at internalizing the external cost of carbon. I have worked with carbon pricing, and my daily work is directly related to carbon pricing instruments. So you can see people have started voting. We will wait for a couple of at least a minute so that we can have more responses. So we have 36 attendees. If all of you could potentially participate in this. So we will keep the session pretty interactive. There will be Menti questions in all the presentations, and also at the end of the session, we have a Menti question which tries to assess the requirement for a training on one of the topics that we talk about. Okay, so we have a pretty mixed bag of colleagues here who know something about carbon pricing and carbon market instruments, but there are some who actively engage on the topic as well. So with that background, I will move on to my presentation. Saurabh, I think we could stop here. Let me know if you can see the screen.
Yes.
Thanks. So, I already spoke of the fact that putting a price on carbon is extremely important, considering the fact that most of the countries that have tabled their ambition, all of these ambitions put together really falls short. And carbon pricing can definitely be an instrument which can help various stakeholders to raise the ambition subsequently. So what exactly is that all about? So climate change has resulted to some sort of market failure. Greenhouse gas emissions are undesired byproduct of various economic activities, and when we don't put a cost on the greenhouse gases which are emitted, then the emissions increase. That has been that has been seen in most of the cases around the world. And polluters are not the same who mostly suffer negative effects of climate change. So there is an external cost of pollution, and that is also related to the social cost of carbon. If the carbon emissions would not have happened, what kind of things would have we avoided? So it is not just the polluters who get affected, but everybody else as well. Now, when we look at carbon pricing, it is all about internalizing the external costs of pollution, putting a price on carbon. And when we talk about putting a price, we talk about 1 ton of greenhouse gas emissions equivalent, which has been emitted. And there are multiple types of prices which is floating around. That depends on multiple factors. For example, what is the sectoral coverage? What are the policies that the government of the country is coming forth with? And then it follows the polluter pays principles. It, of course, incentivizes operators to reduce emissions by switching to low carbon technologies and products. And why is this? This is primarily because they realize that it would be important for them to reduce carbon dioxide, because if they continue emitting the same amount of carbon dioxide over a period of time and they grow in terms of their total addressable market, then they would have to shell out a lot of money in the form of carbon tax or participating in other carbon pricing instruments. Hence, it incentivizes the operators not just to reduce their own emissions, but they also look into innovative solutions of low carbon technologies and products. Now, very quickly on climate change abatement costs. Now, there are marginal abatement cost curves, And we need to look at these cost curves and identify what kind of policies can be implemented on which part of the abatement cost curves. And what are marginal abatement cost curves? These are, in very simple terms, these are representation of carbon emission abatement options against a certain baseline, which is usually the business as usual scenario. Now, if there are negative abatement costs of particular technologies or policies, then command and control policies are implemented. Whereas if there is a certain positive, a lower positive abatement cost related to abatement options, then market-based policies such as carbon tax and carbon permits are brought into action, primarily because they nudge the industry to trigger larger action in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And when there are very, very high costs, they are generally covered as a part of research and development policies. Now, this is important because this helps us understand where, which is the entry point of what kind of policy instrument that could be introduced as a carbon pricing instrument. Now, what are the options that that we have in order to put a price on carbon? There are various options. One is domestic instrument. The other one is international mechanisms. The domestic instruments include carbon tax, where the government comes up with a tax, with a defined tax in terms of what kind of price they would have to pay for every ton of greenhouse gas emissions emitted. The other one is emissions trading scheme, which is a trading scheme as a result of caps which are given to various industry units, that they are allowed to emit only to a certain limit. And if they are unable to meet that cap, then that leads to a demand and supply of credits, which can be traded. The most common and most cited option is the European Union emissions trading system. And then there is energy tax or subsidy reform. I would like to also briefly mention about what is happening in India here. In India, we have indirect carbon pricing instruments. For example, we have what is called Perform, Achieve and Trade, which is essentially energy savings certificate mechanism, where designated consumers have been identified and they have been given a target for reducing their specific energy consumption. And if they are unable to meet those targets, that leads to a demand and supply of energy saving certificate, which can be sold and bought and can be met. So that's an energy saving certificate, but that can be easily converted into what kind of emission reductions have happened as a result of those energy saving certificate, and what's the price that they are paying for each of these certificates. So it's an indirect domestic carbon pricing instrument, but we prefer calling it energy saving certificate program. International mechanisms, I'm sure many of you participating in this session already know or have actively participated in the past on something which is called Clean Development Mechanism. It was one of the flexible market mechanisms as a part of the Kyoto Protocol, which was signed in 1997. And that was an international mechanism where the developed world could created the demand for these credits, and the developing world was generating credits as a result of green projects that were being developed. Now, in the current context, the CDM is kind of ended because the second commitment period until which credits could have been generated ended with on 31st of December 2020. And in 2015, the international community at the climate negotiations came up with what is called Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Now, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is the article which talks about international cooperation for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There are two most important aspects when we talk about carbon pricing instruments here. It is Article 6.2, which essentially is international cooperation between countries for generating what is called ITMOs, internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, and Article 6.4, which is which is if I could say that it is a new version of CDM, but the rules of the game is yet to be written. It has not yet been finalized. There are some sticking points about Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, because of which this is the only article around which the rules have not yet been finalized. And we are looking forward to COP26, where this can firm up. More details around Article 6 will be shared by my colleague, Max, in his presentation. And then there is voluntary carbon market. Now, the voluntary carbon market has been around for quite some time, right from the time when compliance market was there. This is primarily because there are institutions, agencies, companies, governments who have not been mandated to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, but they voluntarily would want to participate and reduce their greenhouse gas, reduce their carbon footprint, and trade and buy credits, which could then help them offset their greenhouse gas emissions. And then there is something called linked ETS. Now, ETSs, as I said, are domestic instruments, but if one domestic instrument is linked with the other, if one ETS, for example, in China has been linked with another ETS, maybe in Australia, then these could, then it becomes an international mechanism. It doesn't remain within the boundary of the country, China or Australia. Moving forward, it's important to understand the differences between the domestic pricing instruments, that is emissions trading and carbon tax, from the perspective of emissions, price and administration. See, carbon tax, emissions are uncertain. We don't know how much emission reduction will happen as a result of introduction of carbon tax, but what we are certain is that we are certain about the price. For example, Singapore on 1st January 2019 introduced a carbon tax of $5 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent that can be reduced. So we are certain of the price, but we are uncertain of how much emissions will happen, which is exactly the opposite of what happens with emissions trading. We are certain of the emissions because the units or the industry are given a target of emission reductions. So we are certain that that will happen, but we are uncertain of the price, at which price will this trading of carbon credits will happen. What is more important to understand here is the administration. The emissions trading scheme design is very complex and needs a lot of time and political will in order to design an emissions trading scheme, whereas a carbon tax is pretty simple, less complex, doesn't have so many design features to be incorporated. But of course, we need political will there as well. I'm saying, so emissions trading scheme is more complex. It can be understood from the fact that China in 2010 had announced that they will come up with a national level ETS. Of course, they did pilots with 7 small regions. And only recently they could announce a national level ETS, that too covering just one sector, that was power sector, which essentially means that they took a lot of time in order to design this complex system of ETS. Let's look at quantity-based and price-based carbon pricing. So as I was talking about emissions trading schemes, here the market sets the price, and the government defines a limit of total emissions that can happen, emissions or reduction targets on each of these sectors, or on the sectors that are targeted as a part of, as a result of this emissions trading scheme. And the affected companies either receive or need to buy emission permits, and each permit is equal to 1 ton of greenhouse gas emission reduction. Trading is allowed, and here the market sets the price because it depends upon the demand and supply principle. Trading favors, because of this trading, it favors the most cost-efficient measure that can reduce emissions and creates optimal conditions for trading in the complex part. What we, as I had said in the previous slide, we are certain about amount of reduction that will happen, but we are not certain about what price will the carbon credit will be traded at. So let's understand one small thing here. It's very simple. We have plant A. There is one permit, one emission permit short. They have two options. Now, the option is that they can either buy one permit at a price of 30 euros or implement an emission reduction measure within the entity at a cost of 100 euros per ton. Now, of course, it takes no rocket science to understand that they would go with option one. However, there can be another option where they have the one option is where they could buy a permit at a price of 30 euros per permit, whereas there is another option where they could maybe do some research. They could identify one of these options and realize that there is an implementation, there is a possibility to implement a reduction measure as at 10 euros per ton. And of course, they would go for second option. Why is this important? It is important because the plant has then invested in thinking what options could be looked at both internally and externally, and which is making most business sense. That is the reason why putting a price on carbon also helps in coming up with innovations, technology upgradation, and so on and so forth. Similarly, when we look at carbon tax, here the regulator sets the price. As I said, I was giving example of Singapore. Singapore government came up with a carbon tax of $5 per ton. This, of course, is directly related to carbon dioxide equivalent emitted or the carbon content of the products. It affects companies paying taxes on every ton released, and hence the companies would think, let's reduce the carbon which is being released as a result of our activities. Now, taxes are normally been passed on to the final consumers, users. Now, what is also interesting to understand is the political stability and acceptability of a policy like carbon tax. I'll give you another example. British Columbia had come up with a carbon tax, and they made it revenue neutral. And by revenue neutral, they meant that all the tax which was being collected will, in some form or the other, will go back to the public at large. So that also ensures acceptability of a carbon tax, and the fact that it doesn't affect vulnerable populations so much. So here again, we are certain about the price, but we are uncertain about the emission reductions that happens as a result of carbon tax. In India, for example, we have what is called coal cess, which is tax on coal, and it's also an indirect carbon pricing instrument, because I don't know if we are allowed to call that, but we could definitely convert 1 ton of coal in terms of how much emissions are happening, and the 400 rupee, which is Indian rupees, which is taxed for every ton of coal used, can be considered as a form of a carbon price. Emissions trading, a lot of sectors are being covered in various emissions trading schemes, which are in different parts of the world. The sectors are waste, forestry, domestic aviation, transport, buildings, industry, and power. It's interesting to see that forestry also falls as a part of this emissions trading scheme. It's only in New Zealand. However, the most sought after is the industry. So the industry has been the most common feature across all emissions trading scheme in different parts of the world. Very quickly, let's also look at the world map of the emissions trading scheme which is being implemented. So the map clearly shows that emissions trading schemes are being implemented only in the northern hemisphere so far. The southern hemisphere still is either contemplating of developing an ETS or are in some stage of implementing and developing the ETS, except New Zealand. New Zealand, of course, is in the southern hemisphere, but the northern hemisphere, North America, Europe, and China, they are all implementing large emissions trading schemes. EU ETS almost covers 3.2% of the global emissions, whereas China ETS is covering 7.4% of the ETS, and Korea is covering about 0.95% of the global emissions. Because we are speaking to an Asian set of colleagues and the participants are from Asia, it is also interesting to see what are the ETSs, or where are these ETSs being considered for development. It's in Pakistan, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Taiwan, and Japan. So these ETSs are still being considered and planned and designed. As I said, it's a very long drawn process, needs a lot of investment in terms of money, effort, energy, primarily because you have to design the features well, you have to identify the industry participants who will participate, establish a cap. How do you establish a cap? What kind of caps do you define? These are interesting aspects, but it requires a lot of time and also requires political will. As I said, China had announced in 2010 of doing and implementing a national level ETS, but it was only possible to launch a national level ETS, that too for just one sector, power sector, very recently. When I say very recently, I mean in the last 2 years. I don't remember the exact date, but yes, it was very recent. But when we look at carbon tax, that's a pretty, of course, there's Europe and America, where we have maximum number of attempts of putting a tax on carbon, and they have been successfully implementing it. But when we look at the southern hemisphere, we have some representatives like South Africa, Singapore, and Chile and others, which have started implementing carbon tax. Now, quickly looking into the positive facts and challenges of carbon pricing. Of course, we know that this helps in prioritizing cost-effective abatement opportunities. The MAC curve that I presented earlier, it also tells us what kind of policy instruments can go for which kind of abatement options, and it also helps us prioritizing it. It stimulates low carbon innovation and technology. As I said, there are companies, when they realize that they would have to pay price for the emissions that they are doing, they would think about low carbon technology innovation, as well as use them in their units. Actors have the flexibility of where and when to reduce emissions, because actors can then decide that once they have various abatement options available, they can decide where is it that in their supply chain would they like to address carbon, and how soon can they start implementing it. It, of course, helps generating revenues for the government. As I said, carbon tax can help raise revenues. What would be more interesting is how does it affect the general public, and can the government think about revenue neutral options where the tax generated goes back to the public. Delivering an economy-wide signal. This has happened several times in the past. Whenever a country has started thinking about carbon pricing instruments, I'll again give the example of China from Asia. When China announced that they are going to come up with the national level ETS, the industry started taking up emission reduction options or opportunities. They started taking up those opportunities and implementing them, because they were anticipating that there will be top-down driven policy which will affect the triple bottom line, and hence it kind of gives a economy-wide signal and of course generates additional co-benefits in terms of jobs and emission reduction, and also contributes to sustainable development goals. What are the challenges? As I said, it can disproportionately hit vulnerable households and communities, and maybe that's when the government should start thinking about how they can support these vulnerable households and communities from the tax revenues collected. Become unpopular among stakeholders because they can get disproportionately affected, and people might oppose carbon tax, for instance, or even ETS, because it kind of limits an entity as far as emissions are concerned. Competitive concerns and carbon leakage. Now, if there is a area where carbon pricing instrument has been introduced, a company which has been working in that area might decide to move out of that region and work in a region where they have carbon pricing policies which are little laxed, and they could potentially continue working the way they were working. This leads to what is called carbon leakage, and this will also lead to competitive concerns, because you become financially less competitive, like you have a more financial burden in comparison to an agency which is working in an area where they don't have those policies in place. So these things need to be taken into account, and I believe some of you already know that the European Union is thinking of what is called a border carbon adjustment mechanism, which is essentially ensuring that when a product comes to the border of Europe, they will assess what's the carbon content in it, and maybe apply a carbon tax same as what is applied with to the products within the country. So that is kind of being discussed at the European Union Parliament, and the deadline for implementing anything like a border carbon adjustment mechanism is 2023. Of course, this will have significant impact on exporters to the European Union, for example, Vietnam, Asia, India, etc., if this comes into existence. Sometimes too low mitigation impact and prices are also low. Incremental reductions instead of transformational change. What would be interesting is that can carbon pricing instruments lead to the transformational change that we are seeking to have as a part of the Paris Agreement? Can it become one of those instruments which helps bridge the gap when we talk about ambitions of emission reductions and the gap that we have in terms of reaching 2 or 1.5 degree target of the Paris Agreement? The role of carbon pricing instruments along the decarbonization pathway, as I said in the beginning, that the carbon dioxide needs to be priced really high to make a business sense, to make a good case, to make a good business case for decarbonization. And carbon pricing instruments have those opportunities. So what do they do in short term, medium term, and long term? The long term objective is to eventually decarbonize and achieve the net zero pathways that are being designed and being announced by various countries. However, there are other carbon pricing instruments, for example, efficiency standards, which are being implemented in different countries on various aspects, regulations on low or zero carbon technologies, and fossil fuel subsidies are considered negative price on carbon. This is primarily because they are subsidizing use of fossil fuels, and it has a negative price on carbon and should be essentially discouraged and over a period of time phased out. There are other pricing instruments like internal carbon pricing instruments. Companies are taking carbon neutrality and net zero targets, and in order to achieve those, they are implementing internal carbon pricing instruments, which can help them generate revenues within the organization, which can then be used for implementing technology innovations within the company to become, to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and eventually embark on low carbon development pathway. And then we have international and domestic crediting mechanisms that we spoke about. The domestic crediting mechanisms being there could be a voluntary carbon market which can be developed within the country. And then you have international crediting mechanisms, which we will listen to from my colleague, Max, in a few moments. But before I end my presentation, there are a few key takeaways. Putting a price on carbon follows the polluter pays principle. Market-based policy instruments are important for prioritizing cost-effective abatement. And this is widely used in almost all economic sectors around the world. The important aspect is that currently carbon pricing instruments are covering only 20% of the global emissions. It would be nice that this is scaled up and used by more countries and more jurisdictions across the world. More and more countries are considering carbon pricing in their nationally determined contributions, which has been announced as a part of the Paris Agreement. And very, very soon there will be a global stocktake where countries will be expected to produce version 2 of their NDCs and show that they are raising ambition. Probably then more and more countries will come up and talk about carbon pricing instruments as as tools to achieve their nationally determined contributions. They are necessary, but not the only policy option that we have. And last but not the least, what is highly recommended to all of you to maybe quickly skim through, read. They have excellent executive summaries. There is a report which is published every year called State and Trends of Carbon Pricing by the World Bank. And it was released in February 2021, the latest version. And we, so they come up with a overview of the carbon pricing landscape and the different options which are being implemented by different parts of the world. So I think that's my presentation. I'll pause here and I will ask my colleague Saurabh to maybe share his screen. We have a few Menti questions for you before we move on to the next part of the session. Saurabh.
Kundan, can I quickly jump in here? We have a few questions in the questions and answers box and also in the chat. And I was wondering, before starting my part, should we take some questions, leave room for a little discussion before I dive into the international mechanisms? Or shall we just continue with Article 6 and the voluntary carbon market?
We can take the questions, Max, but I think before that, let's do the Menti questions, the 2 questions that I have for the audience, and then we will respond to these questions that are there in the chat box. Saurabh, over to you for sharing the Menti again. I would request all the participants to participate in these questions and respond to these questions, please.
Just wait for 5-6 more seconds so that some people can join in. Okay. Kundan, sir, you're on mute.
Yeah, so the question is, which are the two main types of carbon pricing instruments? And then you have options. And please remember, there are only 30 seconds to answer this question. And here we go. So yes, the two main types of carbon pricing instruments, as you also saw in my presentation, we primarily focused on carbon tax and ETS. So they are the two main types of carbon pricing instruments. Saurabh, if we could move to the next question. So the question here is, what do you think is the highest carbon price being used at the moment, which is euros per ton of CO2 equivalent? Okay, so you could see that the highest price which is being used as carbon price is 117 euros per ton, and this is yeah. Of course, there are studies which says that even this price is low in comparison to what we need to have in order to achieve the ambition gap. The 87 euro per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent was the option for social cost of carbon that we have here in India. One of the studies have said that 87 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent is the social cost of carbon in India. Yeah, so with that, I will stop my presentation, and I would like to, before I hand it over to Max, I would like to quickly introduce him. So Max has been working in the realm of international climate policy for several years, with professional experiences both in NGOs, think tanks, and international organizations. And his current position as junior advisor in the Global Carbon Markets Project focuses primarily on promoting carbon pricing and carbon market instruments and approaches across the globe, but in particular in the project partner countries like Uganda, India, Tunisia, and Chile. And he has a master's degree in international affairs from Sciences Po Paris and Free University of Berlin. With those words, welcome Max to the session, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Kundan, for these kind words and kind introduction. A warm welcome to you all from Germany. I'm very pleased to be here and to speak to you and to such an interested crowd. You already have been very active. I saw quite a few questions in the chat box and in the questions and answers box. So perhaps Kundan, you can already answer to some of them, and also maybe some of the questions could be used for a discussion part or a questions and answers part we have reserved for you at the very end of this presentation. Now, I also have prepared a quiz, so I would like to ask you to participate again. Saurabh, thanks for sharing the link. And I will talk to you about international carbon markets. So my questions are concerning global carbon markets, and the first one is, I suppose, a rather easy one for you now that you've already been introduced to some of the key concepts. The question is, which article of the Paris Agreement addresses carbon markets and carbon pricing? Is it Article 6? Is it Article 9, Article 12, or 7? Now, for those of you who have listened carefully to my colleague Kundan, it shouldn't be a problem to answer this question. But if not, then I will enlighten you in a few moments. And we have a very good overall turnout, 14 votes, almost the majority. The majority for Article 6. Very well. So the next question, please, Saurabh. So beyond Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which international carbon pricing instruments do exist? And that's a bit of a more tricky one. Is it Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, short CORSIA, Voluntary Carbon Market, both A and B, or neither A and B? And yes, it's both A and B. It was a tricky question. I will go into the voluntary carbon market today. We will not cover the CORSIA scheme, which is another mechanism, because aviation is not covered under the Paris Agreement. Right, so if you are a bit patient, then you will learn about the voluntary carbon market in a few more moments. Saurabh, next question, please. The practice of compensating for emissions in one place by investing in emission reductions in another place is called, and also this is a bit more tricky, is it compensatory payments? Is it balancing or balancing out? Is it called neutralizing or is it called offsetting? So if companies compensate, then they engage in what kind of activity? And yes, indeed, it's called offsetting. And why offsetting is a difficult concept, you will learn at the very end of the presentation when we talk about the voluntary carbon market. So thanks for these questions. I will now go into the presentation and share my screen. If you could just quickly give me a feedback whether you can see the screen or not. Okay. Now I will go into presentation mode. Does it work? Yeah, perfect. Very well. In case there's any urgent questions, Kundan, Saurabh, please just interrupt me. So let's talk about global carbon markets and the current state. Kundan already introduced you to the key concepts here, and I will go in more depth, and hopefully you'll have a few questions, and we can also discuss about some of the concepts I will introduce. I'll try to be quick to leave room for discussion. Where do we come from? So you all know the Kyoto Protocol was the predecessor of the Paris Agreement, and under the Kyoto Protocol we had so-called flexible mechanisms, and these mechanisms they introduced already market mechanisms on the global level, and the two most well-known are the Clean Development Mechanism, short CDM, and also joint implementation, and these mechanisms basically were there for one reason. They allowed countries with emission reduction targets. So under Kyoto, there was only the industrialized countries to buy emission reductions from developing countries that had no targets and could just sell their units. So this was the first well, cap and trade on the global level, you could say. There was not really a cap, but there definitely was some trade. But global carbon markets started off with the Kyoto Protocol. However, the CDM collapsed in 2012, also as a result of the financial crisis and structural problems. And we had for a couple of years that the global carbon market landscape was quite deserted until 2015. And 2015, we saw the Paris Agreement concluded by all parties, and the Paris Agreement also features Article 6. Article 6 regulates the global carbon market and is can be split into different sub paragraphs. The Article 6.2 encourages parties, so countries, to engage in what is called bilateral cooperation. That is basically two countries engaging in a trade of emission reductions. So for instance, Peru and Switzerland both could start trading. Peru, in this case, selling off emission reductions from one sector to Switzerland that uses these emission reductions to achieve their NDC. Article 6.4, as Kundan already explained to you, is an international mechanism that works very much like the CDM, yet the rules are not concluded, and we are all looking forward to COP26 to do this. The Article 6.4 will basically be under the auspice of the UNFCCC, and will allow for both countries and private entities to trade emission reductions. So already here you see we're not only talking about states in the future global carbon market, but also private entities, and this will play a greater role later on. So to summarize, what is the key difference between Kyoto and Paris? We have in the Paris world, all countries do have emission reduction targets with their nationally determined contributions, NDCs, who you probably all know from your daily work. And the Kyoto mechanism had a focus on the giving flexibility to industrialized countries, whereas Article 6 of the Paris Agreement now focuses on raising overall ambition. So if you will, there is something like a global cap with all NDCs taken together, and now we have to reach this cap. This cap is of course not ambitious enough, as Kundan already explained in the introduction. Yet this is the key difference between Kyoto and Paris. All parties have emission reduction targets, and we have to get there sooner than we now plan to do. As you may know, there are a few problems and crunch issues in the negotiations, which makes the road to Paris a bit bumpy, to Glasgow a bit bumpy, sorry. And it has been a long road from Katowice to Madrid. Article 6 has been negotiated over and over, and there is a few key open questions. The first one concerns the heritage of past global carbon markets, and especially the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism. Now, there are many leftover credits, and some parties, especially those who featured big in the CDM, have a great interest to carry over these units into the new Article 6 world. However, there are other parties that say, well, these units actually they do not stand for actual emission reductions anymore. We have to do additional emission reductions, raising overall ambition. Hence, we cannot allow such carryover. This is the tricky part, and parties have been working with this for now over 5 years, and there's still no solution. Another key stumbling block in the negotiations is the question of double counting. Now, what is double counting? Basically, double counting occurs if one and the same emission reduction is counted for by two parties. So in the example of Peru and Switzerland trading, Peru, if it sells its emission reductions to Switzerland, has to write off this emission reduction in its NDC. So basically deleting 1 unit, and Switzerland has to add 1 unit. And this writing off, this accounting, has to be undertaken by parties. Because if not, then emission reductions are counted twice, and hence the overall ambition loses, right? Because countries can claim that they have achieved something which they haven't achieved. And they can claim to have complied with rules of the Paris Agreement, even if they have not to. And for this, we urgently need corresponding adjustments. Corresponding adjustments do exactly that. They take off the units that are being traded by one party and add them to the other units. But this triggers great discussions. Where do we need corresponding adjustments? Where don't we need corresponding adjustments? And it will play also a role in the voluntary carbon market later on. Now, this, not to bombard you with too many information on the intricacies of Article 6, which are very high because it's a very technical content, let's say. If that was my wish list, I would say we need overall ambition to be raised at a price high enough to trigger behavioral change, need to avoid double counting. We should also finance adaptation because it's not all about mitigation, providing co-benefits, especially sustainable development to non-Annex 1 countries, because that's also what it's all about. And we can have probably a 48-hour or like 2-week discussion on the wish list and what should be there in addition or what shouldn't be there. But let's turn to the actual practice. We have a piloting landscape of Article 6.2 that is being forged by a few multilateral and also bilateral agreements. As Article 6 remains in limbo and is not decided because we're all waiting for COP26, so these actors take initiative and shape out with different countries in different constellations pilots for Article 6.2 especially, because Article 6.2 bilateral cooperation, remember, can already happen as of now, whereas the overall agreement for, let's say, Article 6.4 is needed, and we are still waiting for, of course, the rule book to be finished. There's very successful examples. The most well-known example is Peru and Switzerland. Switzerland with the CLIC Foundation is taking the lead in this piloting landscape. There are also in the Asian continent, as you can see, a few examples. That's mostly the JCM, so that's the Japanese. I believe the CEA is the Swedish Development Corporation, and also the CLIC Foundation in Thailand is active. So this is something, and these pilots are so important to build institutional capacity and to prepare the ground already to be ready for Article 6. Because what we don't want is that only big countries can benefit. We also need the smaller countries that have less capacity to be able to reap the benefits of global carbon markets in the future. And similarly to Article 6.2 pilots, there's also regional cooperation that has been started in order to build institutional readiness and create early movers. So in the Americas, we have 2 different alliances. The same goes for the African continent, West Africa and East Africa, working with the regional countries and building a platform for knowledge transfer and transfer of past experience. And in Asia, as far as I am informed, there is no such alliance. However, I encourage you to think about to have a read in these alliances, how they work, and to have a think about whether that could be relevant to your work, and creating such an alliance could be a realistic option. I think the ADB has been thinking about forming such an alliance, but as of now, there's no such thing. And there's also global initiatives, but I will not go into depth in them. Okay, now I have talked about Article 6 and the Paris Agreement, but we have another kid on the block, and that's not an entirely new actor, but it is taking up speed and creating a huge dynamic. And I'm talking about the voluntary carbon market. And I will just take a few, let's say 4 more minutes to talk about this. So rush a bit through in order to leave room for discussion. The voluntary carbon market is essentially private companies, private sector taking action in order to become carbon neutral or to offset. And how so? They buy offsets from these project developers who often feature very good projects. And the VCM, the voluntary carbon market, is on the rise. And however, it's not. They have just reached the same level as it had in 2011, I think. So no, 2010 it is. So this is the dynamic we are talking about. But there is huge political support, also a lot by private companies, but some big polluters, which is of course maybe also cause for reflection here. That's support the voluntary carbon market in its build-up. Many initiatives that I have portrayed here that talk about scaling up. However, the question is, what do we want to scale? And it has to be of good quality, of course, in order for overall ambition to be raised. And while there is initiatives trying to push the voluntary carbon market forward, there is also a lot of uncertainty for the supply side, for the project developers, because Article 6 is not concluded. They don't know, do they have to undertake corresponding adjustments or not? And of course, this is a difficult situation for them. What's at stake? The stakes are huge, because the voluntary carbon market can be a mechanism to drive up ambition in addition to state action. However, we need this mechanism to be very solid and to be based on good rules in order to work out properly. And these rules, just as a reminder, is concerned first and foremost corresponding adjustment, because the same emission reduction unit can be bought by not only states but also companies, private companies in the voluntary carbon market. And hence the picture gets even more complicated. The companies need to set own emission reduction targets, otherwise simply buying certificates isn't enough in the face of climate crisis, and we need to have robust standards to ensure the quality. So wrapping up, global carbon markets is in limbo, still continues to be negotiated. There are a few initiatives, and you can already engage yourself in the buildup of capacities. However, the potential of carbon markets remains largely untapped. There is huge potential to accelerate the decarbonization of our global economy and also help countries to achieve their NDCs. But we need to have good rules in order to for the Article 6 and also the voluntary carbon market, in order for global carbon markets to raise ambition, because otherwise it can also turn against us and lead to reduction of emission of ambition, And this is a situation we have to avoid at all costs. So now with this, I will maybe open up for discussion and Q&As. And I'm looking to my colleagues to see whether there's a few questions you already would like to take. And Kunal, you want to take over at this point?
Yes.
Great.
Yes. Thanks, Max. So thanks for the questions. They are very interesting questions, and I'll begin with the last question in the list, which is by Tim. He asks, can we scrap all the existing taxes and replace with a single natural resources tax collected at source and based on the eco damage caused by the use and consumption plus UBI and a wealth tax? Now, that's very interesting, Tim, primarily because there has been an attempt, or there has been discussions like this in the past. There is RBI, Reserve Bank of India's governor, who called Mr. Raghuram Rajan, who's now also in the US teaching in one of the universities. I think it's I don't remember exactly. I think it's I don't remember exactly which university, but he had mooted an idea called global carbon incentive, where he said, let's get rid of all these different components and let's talk about a global carbon incentive where a country would need to decide how much they have to pay based on the carbon emissions that are happening as a result of a country alone. For example, if India has an average emissions per GDP, which is 2 tons, approximately 2 tons, and multiplied with a number with the total population and come to a figure of what that is. So they're saying that if we put a price of $10 per ton, and if we use that figure, we can come to a certain, we can create a pool of finances where all the money can be collected, and that can be used for supporting extremely vulnerable countries that need to adapt to the changes in climate. So there are some discussions, but of course, that's even more difficult because then you are asking for a multilateral agreement on designing something like that. That's even more difficult. But implementing carbon taxes at the national level is relatively simpler in comparison to what you are proposing. I understand that these taxes are different, and these taxes are defined based on the national circumstances. For example, in Colombia, the price of a carbon tax is $5, but they also give an option that you can decide as an agency whether you would like to give $5 a ton, or you would want to buy carbon credits from good quality carbon credit projects. So they have an option there. So it is also conducive to the requirements of the industry. As I said, these carbon pricing policies and instruments needs to have political stability and acceptability even within the country. So when you're talking about scrapping all of this and coming up with a universal figure as far as natural resources tax or tax is concerned, that would be very difficult because the national circumstances are different in different countries. And a natural resource getting degraded in India would be very different from the natural resource getting degraded in maybe Germany. And these considerations have to be taken into account while designing a tax or a reform like that. So that's a point, but I would rather suggest we don't take that route as yet. For carbon, yes, it is possible, but for natural resources, I would refrain from suggesting that. That's one question. Max, would you like to take any other question, or should I continue maybe responding to a couple of them?
I see 2 questions that are similar. The one, are we incentivizing a continuation of the problem of emissions? Are the externalities will they be passed on to the consumers? And when revenues are being generated, does it encourage those that can afford to pay for their emissions to continue? I can take them and you complement, Kundan.
Yeah.
Great. So basically the question is, does this carbon price work, and how can we also cushion the effect? Should we cushion the effect on consumers and companies, and if so, how can we do it? Now it's all, I think, carbon tax and ETS, and Kundan is of course here can tell you more about that. It's all about the design. If you have a tax, let's say on energy consumption or fuel, you of course have to think about the design of the tax in order that the most vulnerable groups are not as heavily affected. Let's say there is examples of Canada, I think it is British Columbia, where there is part of the tax being reimbursed to those who pay it. This can be a mechanism in order to ensure that carbon pricing does not hit the poorest in the most hard way, and that those who can afford to are off the hook. At the same time, you need to have the price to be high enough in order to encourage behavioral change. So it is really a very it is a balancing act, and it depends very much on your choice of policy. Which sector do you address? More industry? Do you address more consumers? Will they pass on their costs? And who is affected how? And how can we cushion those effects in order for the just transition to be ensured? Maybe I leave it here. And Kundan, if you want to come in and complement, be my guest.
Yes, Max, that's right. I'll just add at one point where you mentioned, are we incentivizing a continuation of the problem of emissions? I don't think we are trying to, we are incentivizing continuation of that. What we are trying to do is we want to come up with policy instruments which ensures that these players who are responsible for greenhouse gas emissions are being fined enough so that they start thinking about reducing emissions. And when we talk about carbon markets, I understand where you're coming from. This is primarily because in the past, it used to be like this, that, okay, there's no net zero emission. What has happened is emissions happened in Annex 1 countries were offset by emissions which did not happen in non-Annex 1 country. That is the reason why when we started talking about Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, it has a component which Max presented, ambition raising, and this ambition raising can only happen if we address the issue of overall mitigation of global emissions. We are saying that any activity that happens in the carbon market space should lead to overall mitigation of global emissions. It should not simply be an offsetting mechanism. So that is being taken care of, but definitely these initiatives will help incentivize this behavioral change, because if there is a price of $100 per ton of emissions, they would start thinking about ways and means of reducing it. But if they are not given any such, if there are no such policies in place, then they can keep emitting as much as they want and even grow maybe in their emissions. So I would respond to that question like that. The last question that I see before we hand it over to Lydia is, do you, okay, we have more questions now. Are we incentivizing? No, we have done that. Okay. So when we talk about tax, are we considering the last mile consumers after all the extraction is being done by the industry, but its burden would be forced on the public at large. How can this deviation be avoided? Okay, so when we are talking about tax, I understand there will be a trickle-down effect because, for example, the industries who are using coal and they are asked to put up they are asked to pay taxes for the use of coal. There will be some impact on the final price of the product, but essentially what is happening across the world is that people are moving towards more greener products, and they would like to buy products which are less carbon intensive. I understand the last mile consumer would like to have some incentive as well, and that is where so it's very difficult to maybe manage the last mile consumer here, primarily because the product would be bought by multiple people, and managing that gamut of people would be difficult than managing the industry. The point is, maybe we can think about a revenue neutral approach as far as carbon tax is concerned, where where the revenues generated as a result of this tax can then be passed on to the end consumer. That can potentially be possible, but that needs political will and acceptability as well. So I would pause in the interest of time at that point, and I would like to bring in my other colleague, Lydia. And before I hand it over to her, a few lines about her. She has several years of experience in the area of international climate and development policy, and has worked for several years on environmental policy making in countries like Mexico and Germany, and has worked for the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety as an advisor since 2010. And very recently, she took this role of leading this global carbon market project and has steered discussions on of several projects on carbon pricing and carbon markets and Article 6 with a focus in the African continent. She is the project lead of Global Carbon Markets Project and has a master's degree in environmental resource management from Brandenburg University of Technology. With those words, I would invite Lydia to walk us through the last part of the session and say some concluding remarks. Over to you, Lydia.
Yes, thank you, Kundan, for this warm welcome and introduction, and welcome to everybody in this meeting. I was only able to join a few minutes ago, so I'm happy to see that we have more than 60 participants listening carefully to this great presenters and this very important topic. And I also noticed that there are a lot of questions coming up, and maybe we can find a way to still answer them, even though the session is going to conclude. I think we're also sharing information later on for the audience, so you have the chance to look at details that maybe have not been discussed deeply today. And yeah, if you have even more interest in this topic and you need to learn and to understand more, our project, the Global Carbon Market Project, developed a training. And this training is giving you a very good overview of national and international instruments on carbon pricing. We touched them in the presentations, and you may notice they're quite complex and interact with other topics and sectors. And it's quite good to have a better understanding how those instruments work and for which sector or for which aim you want to introduce them. So the training is looking at national instruments like the carbon pricing, like tax or ETS, or the combination of tax and offsets, and it looks also at instruments, or not instruments, like things you should think of, like the revenue use, or how do you engage with stakeholders, and the communication of the pricing is very important. So we try to cover those very important points in those modules. Also, the international instruments, you listened carefully when Max was speaking, the Article 6, the CORSIA, and the voluntary markets are touched and explained much more deeply, and giving an overview what's the state of the art and what is happening on the ground. And this training can be tailored to different target groups. So it depends if you want to have it focused to policymaking participants, or if you want to engage with other public and private stakeholders. So you can blend or you can focus. This training is going to be very interactive, and it has also some games, so it gets much more practical, and you get some first experiences, and then you may be able to draw conclusions for your next steps in the institution where you work. This training can be done virtually. We adapted it to the new circumstances, and therefore it has a better reach out, and we can include much more participants, but it's also designed to be a face-to-face training. So even though we can think about to do a hybrid depending on the situation and circumstances. So we try to be very flexible and be as inclusive as possible. And the training has a length of 1 to 4 days, depending on scope and depth you want to go. And the training is, the information and the material is provided by GCM. Funding needs to be looked at how to do that. Maybe there are other donors who want to participate and finance, or we have other projects that step in. But GCM project can be a good sparing partner. We have already facilitated several trainings, so we already have experiences and can be a good sparing partner. And if you want to have a closer look, the 4 days can be seen here at this slide, where you see how this is a way the training can be done. But of course, this is just an example, and as it is tailor-made, it can be blended and combined in the way the audience needs it. So if all topics are covered, as I said, it's going to last 4 days. And it has, of course, breaks and also interactive parts where you get together, discuss, ask questions, draw conclusions, make first, let's say, thinking around your circumstances and what you may need to introduce or to prepare the ground for having a good conversations on carbon pricing. I would like to stop here because we are already running out of time, and we have also prepared a few questions to have a first impression. If you have interest in participating in such a training. And maybe you have a look at the chart, you find there a new Menti code and slide where you please go. And there you see some questions we prepared for you. So we get a sense and the feeling for the group where the interest is laying now. And we already have some answers. Please give us some insight in which topics you are interested if this training is going to be offered. And I don't know, is this possible to give more than one answer?
No, just one answer.
Okay, so you have to choose your priority. And maybe in the chat, if you want, you can also add the other topics that you are interested in. But we see here already voluntary markets and Article 6 are front runners and have a lot of interest. Thank you very much. Okay, Article 6 is now number 1. And then internal carbon pricing is also coming up. Okay, actually UK started to have an internal carbon pricing, which is quite high. So this is also a very interesting tool to monitor and to check emissions. Okay, Article 6 is now the number one. Do we want to move on to the next question?
There's just one question. Yeah.
There's just one question. Okay, good. Well, then maybe if you have other interests concerning the training, you can also put them in the chat. I would say we have learned that Article 6 is the running, the front runner. We do have very good information on our carbon mechanism website. We can share also the link. There you find latest news, documents, studies. Please go and have a look there. And yeah, I would hand over to Kundan and Max, and I thank you very much for the interest and for your active participation, and looking forward to continue conversations around carbon pricing and carbon market instruments, because they are truly a good instrument, yeah, to foster ambitious climate mitigation.
Sure.
Thanks, Lydia. Before I hand it over to Anandan, just one last word. If you are interested in this training, please write to us. Max has already shared the email IDs of both me and him. We could jointly discuss and decide how do we go about doing the training. So with that, I will hand it over to Anandan. Over to you, Anandan.
Sure. Thank you so much, Kundan. And of course, thank you so much to all the speakers, Lydia, Kundan, and Max. We really had an insightful and interesting session. And thank you to the panelists for the insightful answers as well. And we hope that participants gain some ample overview of various carbon market instruments. I would like to reinstate that to the participants that we are planning to come up with this training, along with GIZ or separately as well as part of Asialinks partnership. Certainly some trainings are going to come up in this space. So based on all the inputs that you have provided, and also the feedback form is going to pop up at the end. So based on all your inputs, we will gather and come back to you with further information later. And thank you to the participants for your patience and for all the support. If you have any further questions or support needed in this space, please write to ALP Secretariat, or you have any specific questions to speakers, you can also directly write to the speakers. The email IDs have been given in the chat box. And these sessions are being recorded, and we'll share the materials later to you. So next slide. So you have a feedback form that we posted in the chat box. You could either fill it here, or you can, when the session ends, a form pops up, you could fill it there. And a quick announcement of the next session before we move on to the virtual group photo. Tomorrow at 11 a.m. we have the session on transparency. It's on the enhanced transparency framework guidance for implementation. And in the afternoon at 2:30 p.m. Bangkok time, we have a session on institutional arrangements for robust transparency system. We hope to see some of you there as well. Now it's time for a virtual group photo. If I may request all the panelists and also ALP Secretariat colleagues to turn on their video. So may I ask Sashi to our colleague to click the photo?
Yes.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sashi. And thank you so much once again to GCM colleagues, and a very big thank you to all the participants as well. Bye and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.